Okay, I think we can start, and I will be admitting people as they are coming. Hello, everyone from Sarajevo. Welcome. Thank you all for joining us today on this webinar. There are more than 100 people who have registered for this webinar coming from more than 35 countries. So we are here a wealth of experiences and cultures, and that's very exciting. My name is Aida Vežić, and I represent the Balkan Museum Network, organization that is a partner in a European project called SHIFT. At the very beginning, I want to give you a few technical information. So this webinar is being recorded, and the recording might be uploaded to YouTube channel of the SHIFT project, not the questions part, but the lecture part. You are free to switch off your camera during the whole webinar. You are also free not to use your real name in order to protect your identity if that's what you would like. Please mute yourself during the lecture because the sound can disturb the quality of us understanding and following the webinar. What is really useful sometimes is that you can use the option in Zoom to turn on the CC or closed captions. That feature is helping you read the subtitles while also following the webinar, and it might be easier for you to follow in that way. So that will be a short technical information at the very beginning to make this experience enjoyable for all of us. I will tell you just a few words about the Balkan Museum Network and the SHIFT project. So the Balkan Museum Network is a platform. We have 200 members, which are institutions, organizations, and individuals. And we all gathered around shared values, and that is to protect and promote rich cultural heritage of the Balkan region. The network exists since 2006, so we have turned 18 years. We are an adult now. And the network provides a lot of opportunities for learning, for reconnecting colleagues across different borders, because we organize conferences, trainings, we produce publications, and we seek opportunities for museum professionals to continue their development. This is the second webinar within the SHIFT project. So we are delighted to have you all here. SHIFT is an abbreviation for the actually full title of the project, which is Metamorphosis of Cultural Heritage into Augmented Hypermedia Asset for Enhancing Accessibility and Inclusion. The title itself already tells you that this project is focused on accessibility and inclusion. It's made possible with the collaboration between museums, network of libraries, associations, universities, companies, many partners coming from Romania, Greece, Spain, Germany, Hungary, Bosnia and Herzegovina. In 36 months, which is the duration of this project, we are planning to develop innovative tools that help citizens engage with cultural heritage, with rich European cultural heritage. The SHIFT project will develop novel technologies that enable everyone, and especially blind and visually impaired persons, to enjoy cultural heritage thanks to its better representation and more engaging storytelling. We are developing different tools that will enhance visual part, the touch part, the haptic, but also the usage of language and the way we interact with cultural heritage. The project develops technologies that will support their adoption to creative and cultural industries. So we are looking into possibilities of having this, widespread among different actors. SHIFT is one of the 6 projects which is funded by the European Commission Horizon Europe project under Cluster 2. I will paste now the links to both SHIFT project and the Balkan Museum Network in chat. So you can explore the website, but also you can explore social media and start following the project. Because picture is worth 1,000 words, I will also show you a short 2-minute video about the project so you can get a better sense what is this project really about. So first in the chat, the links, and now I will share my screen to show.
Hello and welcome to a presentation of Shift, a project funded by Horizon Europe to make cultural heritage more inclusive and accessible using technology. Shift, metamorphosis of cultural heritage into augmented hypermedia assets for enhanced accessibility and inclusion. Shift supports the adoption of digital transformation strategies and the uptake of tools within the creative and cultural industries. Shift is one of a cluster of 6 projects funded under Cluster 2 of Horizon Europe, preserving and enhancing cultural heritage with advanced digital technologies. Shift is leveraging advances in artificial intelligence and machine learning to improve cultural heritage access for European citizens experiencing sensory impairment. It aims to enrich everyone's experience of interacting with cultural assets through visual, auditory, and sensory modalities, for example using haptics. Results are thematically clustered into a visual toolkit that will enable automatic transcription of cultural heritage content using artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms. The toolkit will identify objects and actions, which assist in transcribing the historical depictions at economies of scale. An auditory toolkit that will deliver an emotional response to the audience by using advances in auditory synthesizers. Human-like correspondence will minimize barriers for effective interaction by people with sensory impairments. A haptics toolkit will enable multi-sensory interaction with digital objects through a novel approach which delivers haptic feedback, emulating the feeling of touch in a digital object. An IPR toolkit will address the challenge of protecting digital native content. Shift will adopt international standards on copyrights and digital protection of derivative copyrights. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to our social media channels for more information on cultural heritage, technology, accessibility, and inclusion.
Yeah, that was a short video about Shift, but we have another really interesting video, which is showing how we are using automatic audio translation. So I will also give you the link here in chat, and you can see the second video on our YouTube channel of the project. So about our webinar today, we will have a presentation around 90 minutes, and then we will leave 30 minutes for questions. You can use chat options to ask the questions during the presentation, but I will read them at the end to our presenter. Or at the end, you can choose to ask them yourself by unmuting yourself. I'm really happy that we are talking about metadata because cultural heritage is evolving rapidly thanks to digital technologies. The transformation of the whole sector is resulting in our easier online access to cultural material for everybody. But in order for that dream to come true, we need some preconditions to happen. And today's lecture will talk about them. I know Fedja for 20 years, and I'm so happy that he said yes to giving this presentation and a lecture. He's information and communication expert. He's researching and practicing in the field of data science, information technology, knowledge management, and communication. He collaborates as a consultant with many governmental, non-governmental organizations, but also with the business sector. Fedja strives to transfer his knowledge and experience to students of library and information science at the Faculty of Philosophy, University of Sarajevo. So Fedja, the floor is yours. Take us to this interesting topic.
Okay. First of all, thank you for inviting me, and I must say I'm very excited to hold this small webinar. My attempt to kind of bridge a somewhat a divide between different information and cultural heritage professions, because I see it in my daily practice. So we will talk about metadata, but more in the sense of not, I'll try not to be too technical, but I want to be somewhat technical. And if there are any questions like Ada said, you can write them down. If it's really important, I'll try to answer while I'm talking. Okay, so these are the key points, and I apologize if you can hear my Viber because I didn't read it. So the point is to understand the importance of metadata and descriptions in managing museum collections and artifacts, and to explore the standardization of descriptions, which we all, and you probably know that is not entirely possible already, and to see what kind of open source software exists that can help us in managing these vast collections that we have with use of different metadata standards. And in the end, to explore the strategies, which I would like actually to more hold for a conversation than talk about it, but I'll just talk about some of the experiences I've had, mainly in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I'll mention some of the attempts that have been done in the region of the Balkans, because that's mainly where I work, but it's also something that I think kind of transfers knowledge from experience where we are not entirely developed in this area, what we are doing now, but we are also have been aware of different changes in the world. So this is a brief overview of the presentation, just for your information, and I will try to run through it as fast as I can in order to get to the examples and case studies and showcases of some of the projects that I've been involved with, either technically or as a support or as a consultant, and particularly our use of free and open source software that kind of will show also the issue that not only museums but any other cultural heritage institutions have in terms of deciding which software to use when they're approaching it. Aida mentioned some biographical data about me, but here's some additional data. So I've been a senior teaching assistant at the chair for information science at the University of Sarajevo for more than 8 years. And 20 some years as a librarian, mostly, but archivist, where I also try to kind of bridge the divide between different institutions and different collections that are not library collections, but museum collections and archiving and archives as well. I've been a consultant on several digitalization projects in Bosnia and Herzegovina, mostly with archives and museums, sometimes with libraries, and most importantly, I've been a strong advocate of free and open software used in libraries, archives, and museums, which you will probably see when I talk about these examples that I've collected for you. So, in terms of the museum professionals, the museums have probably been the slowest to adopt the common metadata standards, but not as slow as sometimes in terms of other institutions. Libraries have always been at the forefront, but only because, in my belief, it's been easy to create a common standard for the description of the library collections, while museums are so diverse as well as archives that they had to struggle more in discovering all these solutions for the for the common metadata standards. However, this is one of the other issues that I've noticed, and not only me, but many authors who were talking about metadata and its use in libraries, archives, and museums, is that mostly museum professionals have the feeling that their practices and needs have been shoehorned into structures that were developed by another community with quite different epistemologies, practices, and users. And that is quite true to some extent, but I'm really glad that this is not the case. And okay, so Aida warned me that that the sound is kind of snappy, so I'll switch off my video because there's no need for you to look at my face. So hopefully this will work. I'll look at Aida if she just nods on it. It's fine. It's still patchy. Okay. Okay. We'll I'll try to work with it. If it doesn't work, then I'll switch to another network. So at the beginning, I know that most of you, or if not everyone, knows the DIKW model that kind of comes from data or metadata and increases towards wisdom that we are all kind of striving to, not only as professionals but also as individuals. But mostly, what I will do is I will focus on this part of data and metadata as a basis for actually build up towards information knowledge. And I think that this build up towards information was always a point of friction in terms of not only museums but archives and libraries, in terms of how much knowledge can we get from metadata. But before I talk about metadata, I'll just give a brief kind of definition of what is data. And it's facts, figures, or instructions presented in form that can be comprehended, as you can see here, but communicated by a human being or processed by a computer, which is really important in this second part, so that it's readable both by humans and understandable by humans, but also by computers. And most of the data is separated to structured data, which follows a specific format or organization, and unstructured data, which is an information with no formal structure. And this is very important when we go to metadata, because all of the institutions that I'm mentioning have always used some form of unstructured data for some aspects of description of their collection, and in some cases structured data. So it's not something new, except that in the past more than 60 years, we have a surge of computer power that we can now use to kind of process this data better and visualize it and use it for our work. So when we talk about metadata, it is literally data about data, but I would say structured data or structured information describing an information resource object for a variety of purposes. As you can see, this is from the online dictionary for library information science. But also structured data about anything that can be named, which is quite important to have in mind. That's something that I kind of used from Dublin Core definition. And when we talk about museums, the most obvious context is the museum catalog record, which all museums have it in paper or in some kind of computer structure. And that is also something that you will see how it works. But when we talk about metadata, we have to talk about descriptive, structural, and administrative data, which is really important, particularly important for museums. In libraries, this is kind of easier to do. Most of the administrative data is related to how did we get the item and so on. While in museum work, this administrative element has been a increasingly important for different social reasons and not only professional reasons. But as you can see here, we first start with the descriptive metadata, which is basically facilitating indexing, discovery, identification, selection. And this is something that we will be focusing on to some extent in terms of title, creator, subject, keywords, and description. And also structural metadata, which describes the internal structure of complex information sources. And this is where the friction of metadata kind of starts in terms of different cultural heritage institutions, how complex information resources are, and how complex can we be in their description, or should we be in their description. Some of the examples I'm showing here are mostly focused on digital or digitized items and information objects like camera use, aperture, exposure, and so on. But it's also a question of this structural data becomes more complex if we're talking about diverse collections that museums hold. And finally, the administrative metadata that talks about management of resources, rights management metadata, which is really important in terms of all of the institutions, the GLAM institutions, preservation metadata, which sometimes is ignored in some of the metadata sets, and technical metadata describing the physical characteristics of a resource, which is again a very complex issue for museums as institutions that hold different information objects. You have a suggestion here. What you can see about is an introduction to metadata, which I think it's very useful. But in terms of the examples of this administrative metadata, I can try switching to other. Yeah, I can. Yeah, just give me a minute. Sorry. Okay. I switched off my my headphones. Maybe you can hear me better. Okay. Okay, great. Sorry. So he's going back to the examples, when and how they were created, who can access them, software required, copyright permissions, but also how they were actually how did they arrive to a certain institution, which I said is probably something that is most important thing right now in many of the countries of the world. But most importantly, in terms of metadata, is to say is that it enables you and enhances in discovery and reuse of data, but also the objects. And reuse of data is something that is really important, and I will show you why. Because people that I work with in museum institutions and art institutions are always afraid that they need to reshape the data at one point and how difficult it will be and so on. And this is something that I will try to explain how easy it is to do once we have some form of structured data. That doesn't mean that you will not have to add some data, but if nothing, the basic data will always be reusable. The second point I want to make is that for metadata to be useful, it needs to be standardized. And that's why we will talk mostly about standards. And that's why we will talk about these schemas that are actually a key component of the metadata. When we talk about schemas or schemes, or however you want to pronounce it, these are the elements where you have these are the parts, of the schemas, which are elements, content rules, formats, and controlled vocabularies, which are really important. And in the end, syntax, which is mostly supported by open standards such as XML, and in past couple of or 10 years, let's say JSON, which is again very similar to XML. When we talk about good metadata, because there's also bad metadata, let's say, we should also talk about these elements, which is that it should be appropriate to the materials of the collection. And that's why we will discuss whether we can have a universal approach to metadata. It should also be appropriate to users of the collection, which is one of the issues that has been discussed for the past 20 years, and what is it intended for, and also what are the resources that we can use to create these metadata. The use of standard control vocabularies is not something new, but it is important how to use it. Some of the institutions don't have enough expertise to identify what are the best sources. Sometimes they rely on other sources that cannot be localized effectively to other countries. I'll show one of the examples where one of the projects had issues with not only the controlled vocabularies, but also description of some objects. And these controlled vocabularies should reflect to what, where, when, and who of the content. And like I said, some of the existing controlled vocabularies are not always inclusive. They are very specific for specific cultural context and so on. And that can be an issue. But more often it is a list of accepted terms or descriptors used to describe a resource, which aids in organizing retrieving similarly themed items. But this also is one of the issues where we have discussions all the time because of the language and how accessible this metadata is if it's in another language that we don't understand. One of the third point is that good metadata should be authoritative and verifiable, which means that metadata records are objects themselves and should have the qualities of archivability, persistence, and unique identification. The verification is very important today because we need to be able to verify that the metadata record that we are exchanging, sharing, or retrieving is indeed authoritative and reliable. And we will talk about these issues a bit later, not in detail, because that could be a webinar for itself. And most importantly, all of this metadata should support interoperability. That means that it should support seamless compatibility between one system or product with other systems or products. And the examples I will show you do that, and they should, as they should. But the final point is that good metadata helps to ensure a long-term management of the resources in collection without any loss or change for that matter. This is just a brief typology of data standards that I will not go through too much, but as you can see here, it's just a question of what kind of standards exist. There are these data structure standards, which are mostly familiar to some of you through Dublin Core metadata elements or VRI core, and categories for description works of art and so on. And then data value standards, where we have these controlled vocabularies. Some of them are, or most of them, all of them should be familiar to you, as well as data content standards, Anglo-American Cataloging Rules, ISDD as its international form, RDA, and so on. And then we have the data formats, which are really important for technical interchange or exchange of the metadata. And you can see here again RDF, Mark 21, Mark XML, EAD, which is used in archives, Lido XML, which is its counterpart for museums, and then simple W4 XML, and so on. And VRA, which I will show you one of the examples that I have. But these are just examples of these, let's say, standards with a mixed typology, so to speak. But it is important that there are many standards that are kind of commonly shared between libraries, archives, and museums. And the most known is Dublin Core because it's the most simple one. Then Europeana, the data model, which is known for those who deal with European cultural heritage. And it is a good attempt to find a commonality between different data models and unify them, present them to in one point of access, and as well as CDOC conceptual reference model, which is kind of one of the first ones that appeared in museums, Darwin Core for natural museums, and CDWA for works of art. Then we have Spectrum, which is I would say new but relatively newer from these, and it's a very complex set of rules, procedures, and metadata, and Lido, which I already mentioned as an XML schema. All of these, to some extent or other, can be used in and have been used in all of the institutions of cultural heritage for describing the information objects that these institutions hold. I would say Dublin Core is the most dominant, but then we have EAD and EDM as its newer form of Europeana's newer data model, ISD and VRA Core as such. However, there is no single metadata standard or set of standards adequate for describing types of collections and materials. And that's probably the biggest issue right now for everyone in these institutions when they are trying to describe their collections, particularly if they are very diverse, such in case like our National Museum that has a really diverse range of collections that should be and have to be described differently. And their main issue is how you approach this in one way. Now we come to this question of why is this even important to museums? And you can see here these three points. The third point is of a mixed importance, not only for the professionals but also for public. But I will start with the management of information objects because this is the easiest way and the most reliable way to manage information about rights, access, use, location control, exchange of physical artifacts that are held in museums, so loans and acquisitions as well, where we can store a lot of important information, historical information, how a certain object was acquired, how it was also renovated or conserved, and so on. Then we have the document, which is this part that I mentioned also in a sense, which is data about objects, materials, dates, creator, and so on, but also about, like I said, its origin, which is really important today. because of some issues related to inconsistencies in how we acquired, well, different museums acquired some of their information objects. And finally, when we talk about sharing information, it's sharing what a certain museum holds, how did it get it, and if there's any doubt in fairness of acquiring these objects in the past, then the process of restitution or some kind of negotiation of settlement can be started. But it's also a question of, I would say, more important in terms of sharing these information to the wider public, which opens up the museum to a wider range of audience that can visit the collection, but also showing their importance, particularly in the age when the funds are being completely scarce for all of the museum collections, and not only in this part of the world where I come from, but everywhere else, even in the United States. And that's something that's where we can contribute also with familiarizing the wider audience on what is out there, why museums exist, and finally to actually have our say in combating misinformation. Disinformation generally contribute to society in terms of media and information literacy. Because sometimes I have feeling that all of us have been excluded from this conversation. But when we talk about museums in general, the use is mainly focused on resource discovery in order to find and identify digital or physical resources for an exhibit, for a certain project, and so on, but also planning of digitalization of these objects, either 2D or 3D objects that we deem are important to be presented in a certain way online. Also, for establishing structure within or among resources, and that's also for viewing and using the metadata, but also describing these objects in for different purposes, catalogs, exhibitions, and so on. And finally, for preservation, when we talk about digitalization, it's mostly the focus of the discussion is preservation. But I would say that it's also about accessibility to some extent. When we talk about digital resources, then it's mostly about images and other multimedia files, but also digital collections or digital born information objects like digital art, digital archival materials, and so on, of different sorts, from social sciences data to objects of culture or cultural heritage. So what are the best practices? When we talk about best practices, we always say that good data documentation is essential to find, use, share, and manage data, especially over time. And so far, my experience has shown that in some cases, even the documentation that was good at a certain point is not sufficient now for organization, and it can easily be lost to some extent. So the best practice here is also that when we have good data documentation, it's also about preservation of this metadata, because we cannot only rely on one point of access, and also making sure that they are always retrievable. So when we talk about this documentation, we mostly talk about the context of data, why and how data was collected, the structure of data, including how multiple files relate to each other, quality assurance, that I've mentioned, information on data confidentiality, access and use conditions, where this is applicable, and identification and tracking of different versions of data sets. So when we talk about all of this in terms of best practices, we also have to talk about social or audience or community participation in this kind of efforts. And they are something that then requires standardization, because that is the only way you can at least try to standardize even taxonomies or any kind of community participation. So the key metadata standards for museums, in my opinion, are these. But I will focus mostly on these three, because all of the others are probably familiar to you, depending on which kind of museum do you work at, or are not relevant. While Dublin Core, the European data model, as an example of an all-encompassing negotiating model for the presentation of information objects or cultural heritage objects online, as well as Spectrum, because of its very detailed procedures, policies, and so on that lead to standardization of metadata entries. So I will talk about first Dublin Core, because it's probably the easiest and most used metadata element set today, particularly when we talk about the digital representation of the objects that museums hold, but also other institutions. And it is relatively small, and it's a generic set of metadata elements that not only professional communities can use, but also semi-professional enthusiasts can use it, and because of this, the experts or non-experts can describe and search across the wide variety of information resources on the World Wide Web. This makes it a very inclusive, democratic, and accessible to an extent, even though it's not always understandable. Some of the experiences I've had with the students that were involved in the projects also show that even though we kind of talk about DCMES throughout the years of their education, some of the elements are not always understandable to them, but it is probably the easiest metadata elements set to use. And that makes it really cheaper to create and maintain, because even if you don't have a system to control it, it's easy to create, describe these elements, and it kind of goes away from a physical context of how collections in museums, archives, and libraries are organized, and puts a focus on a very specific item or a document or any information object, instead of on hierarchy of where this exists, where this physical object is stored in space, which is kind of a disadvantage as well, to some extent, if you need an information system to manage your physical collections as well. Also, one of the other disadvantages that I emphasize here is that some of the sets, element sets in this metadata standard may need to be augmented by other types of metadata in order to address the needs of specific user communities and to adequately describe particular types of collection materials. And I will show you an example of where two of my colleagues had to actually deviate from Dublin Core to another standard, because it just it wasn't sufficient for what they needed. So they had to select another standard for describing these information objects. But because it has 15 core elements, it is, like I said, probably the easiest to use, and most inclusive. It doesn't require a lot of expertise, and it guides you quite well through the process of describing an information object that you want to describe. European data model is basically trying to include Dublin Core, but also other standards such as EAD, coded archival description, and LIDO, and to transcend these domain-specific metadata standards, but still to accommodate this range and richness of community standards that exist. And it was developed together with technical experts from the library, museum, and archive and audiovisual collection domains, which is really important because that means it's, again, very inclusive, and it takes into account all of the specific needs of each of these communities. And that makes it, that was the only way that it could actually achieve its success that I believe is achieving. But this particular new version of or EDM is even basically better, because the original data model didn't quite hit the mark with all of these things that I mentioned here. And finally, Spectrum, which was created by Collection Trust, and I have some issues with it in terms of its non-openness or closed. It's been a closed system for a while, but I would say that it's kind of becoming more open, and it's mostly intended for museums with humanities collections. You can see here historical, ethnological, art collections, and so on. And as they say, it's a guide to good practice for museum documentation, established in partnership with the museum community. And it contains procedures for documenting objects and processing and so on. But what is important to understand that it's not only a metadata standard for museum collection documentation, but it's also a procedural standard. And it includes information on, in this case, because it was created for UK specific use, UK standard for museum documentation, but it can be adapted or adopted by other countries. And that's why it has been recommended for a while in the international level as a good standard of practice. But as you can see here, we have 9 basic procedures that are core procedures out of 21 procedures, and they are considered essential for managing collections, while other standards are dependent on the condition, human resources, and so on. And it also has an XML a document type definition that has been produced, which serves as a system neutral interchange format for museum data that is based on Spectrum. So it also it doesn't lock you in a specific system. One of the issues that I will mention, some of the library metadata standards that exist out there that are based on MARC as a basic standard are proprietary and have been known to lock you in a specific system that you work in with your metadata, which prevents you then in turn of exploring other options if you are not satisfied after several years of these systems. And Vulcans has one of those systems in use. But it also, some other examples come from Croatia, where a company was hired to develop archival management information system for the archival community in Croatia. And then what they did when the archival community wanted to change the system and go away from this proprietary system, they claimed that they own metadata. So these are some of the issues that that exist not only in the Balkans, but also are known to exist in other countries and parts of the world. What is important and why I mentioned these three models particularly is because they, for professional use, offer this sense of structured data. They solve the problem of interoperability, or as I say here, they're at least trying to solve this problem to an extent, trying to preserve complexities of information objects, and trying to distinguish between physical objects and their digital representation, which is really important because even in that sense, the digital object itself becomes information object, and for a certain period of time, some of the communities, museum, archival, and library communities did not make this distinction. But it's also very inclusive of digital born material, where we can also describe them quite well. And they are adaptive to the needs of the communities that they serve, so they are not locked in. They don't control all of these standards, except that you have to be aware that if you do some adaptation of these standards, then everything that is within the standard can be exchanged, while these additions can cause a problem in the future. But for community members, these models provide unmediated access to collections, which has been an issue for a while, where, well, for ages, in that sense that there was a friction between community members in different countries, that all of these models that exist out there are quite complex to use. They take time to learn, and are very I'll use a word that probably doesn't describe it well, but colloquially we could say they are elitist, and they are not inclusive as such. So these models basically, particularly Dublin Core, kind of does a democratization of access to knowledge, which I think it is quite important, and allow for involvement in creation of metadata, but also creation of collections through shared taxonomies or objects, or tagging, shared tagging, or community tagging. And there have been a couple of examples in some of them that I know in the United States, in terms of tagging museum collections to make them more accessible. But finally, when we talk about accessibility of collection, I'm mostly talking about accessibility in terms of disabled persons or people with disabilities, with those who are blind, visually impaired, or in some cases, which I think could be improved, people with motoric disabilities, but that's also a question of how the systems are organized and created. So this all means that, coming back to the good metadata, a point that we should focus even in the future, and not only now, that we focus on where user can gain unmediated access to information objects over a network. That means having good metadata set and structure, certifies the authenticity and degree of completeness of the content, establishes and documents the context of the content, identifies and exploits the structural relationship that exists within and between information objects, provides this range of intellectual access points for an increasingly diverse range of users. So it removes this elitist view of point on all of our institutions, and present some of the information that an information professional might have provided in a traditional in-person reference or research setting, which again makes it allows for unmediated access to these information objects. I will say that this context of the content and the structural relationship and so on, and the authenticity and degree of completeness of the content are probably the most important parts for museums in terms of some of the elements that are socially important, which is decolonizing museums, making them more accessible in terms of community participation and so on. So I have kind of reached the a point of these case studies, and I promised, and I think I've achieved that I will try to run through these introductory elements as fast as I can. I can go back to them one point, but all of these examples here, not all of them, but the two, the first example is basically community-based efforts to create an online archive of anti-fascist struggle with women of Bosnia and Herzegovina and Yugoslavia through a sort of an informal cooperation between the National Archives and one particular CSO in Sarajevo, where archives didn't have the resources to organize this collection that they've had since the 1950s, a bit later, and didn't have the resources to digitize it, nor did they know how to approach it. So that's the first example I will show you. And then we will talk about the current efforts of the Museum of Literature and Theater of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and these issues between how to approach collection management versus digitalization of the collection and how to manage all this data. And this has been an issue that I've been exploring with them last year and continue to explore it this year. Because there are still some issues that we need to kind of reach conclusions for, as well as the issue of having a quite small team working in this museum that is a really important object of culture for Bosnia and Herzegovina. The other issue is that while they are called museum, most of their collection is kind of organized as an archive. And then I will talk about university projects that either my colleagues worked on and helping them on the technical matters, or where the project that we kind of use in classroom, where we work together with our students to use metadata for storytelling, which is this mapping of UNESCO listed non-material culture in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but also identifying potential non-material culture for local purposes, going beyond the UNESCO listed non-material culture in BIH. I'll just have to exit from this screen and share my full screen. Okay. So I'll just go through this before I show you these projects. I'll just go through even a history of how all this metadata story kind of came into my life for the past more than 20 years, where Dublin Core was created in its initial version was created in '95, and it's these sets are really easy to use that were kind of inspired to they inspired Europeana to create their own set in order to, just like I mentioned, solve some of the issues that Dublin Core doesn't solve well. So I will just talk about these softwares for a while. So one of the software that we've been using extensively in the region is Omeka. It's been localized to Bosnian, Croatian, and Serbian particularly, but I think it was also localized to other languages in the region, except I'm not sure about Albanian. And most of the projects that I worked on so far in terms of digitization or representation in metadata description of these digitized objects, we've used Omeka Classic, which is sufficient for a specific project. But recognizing that you would have to have multiple instances of Omeka Classic in some cases, the organization that created Omeka has created Omeka S, which I will show you in a minute, with an intention to kind of also facilitate exchange of these objects between different institutions, so they can be freely or to some extent through negotiations used in different virtual exhibits. So this is part of the digital representation of the of museum collections and archival collections. But on the other side, you have collective access that probably most of you have heard of, which is also based on PHP, and it's somewhat easy to manage, but it is a bit more complex than Omeka. But it gives you more openness to use it in different settings for management of your physical collection, but also your digital collection, and it allows for different metadata schemas to be included here. That doesn't mean that Omeka doesn't allow for other schemas, but its main purpose is to manage digital objects or digitized objects. So it is not sufficient as an information system for any museum. It doesn't allow for especially for large museum collections, easier localization of these objects in space or of these artifacts, while collective access kind of does that, depending on which of the options or schemas you use or the metadata element sets. And it also gives you this unified access to for the users in terms of the Pautakit web publishing software that allows for different as well as Omeka in that sense. And you have some of the featured projects here. I'll share all these links with you through Aida. I'll send them to her so she can distribute it to you. So the reason why I'm mentioning this is because the Museum of Literature and Theater of Bosnia and Herzegovina is going currently through these dilemmas of which system to use, and do we use both or just one, and then kind of exchange the metadata set, which is quite easy, and it doesn't have to be one or the other, as long as you decide which data set is the most important, and then you can kind of transfer it to a lower one, equalize this access for the public, or abandon one system entirely. So this here is just an example of one of the collections that they started digitizing, and that's the collection of Kadzaim, which was he's one of our authors that died very young. He died very young, and his family decided to donate most of the his work and artifacts to the museum. He was not only a writer but also a radio host during the war and so on. So this collection is quite important. But since they don't have enough expertise in describing these documents in objects in terms of metadata sets that exist out there and making them accessible and interchangeable, the students of the university of our chair got involved in describing it, and then we kind of started from there. So I'm showing you now another collection that they've recently acquired. And they've used this table here to kind of write down basic information of the documents that they received in order to have them prepared with the contract of deed, because all of the documents were a present from or donation from the wife of Zdravko Bebel, who was one of our professors and intellectuals in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And the problem here exists that they started listing it as our inventory books prescribe it since the 60s or 50s even. But what is important is that it is a structured data set, and through this I could adapt all of this data to conform it to either Omeka or Dublin Core in this case, or to collective access that we are kind of working with as well in a testing phase. But before I go through that, I will just first show you the AFEZ archive that I first mentioned, and in that list, which I've said is the archive of anti-fascist struggle of women of Bosnia and Herzegovina, because it shows it's kind of an amateur, let's say, or non-professional project in a sense, that was supported by some of us, not only me, but by another colleague who's a librarian, and we joined forces with them to build this collection that they digitized. Mostly, we've also involved some of the students from not only our chair, but who are also studying art history, to help them to work with this vast collection that was never actually organized upon its acquisition by the National Archives of BIH. So what they did here is, and that's why I want to show it to you, apart from having the archival collection here as a core collection present, they also started collecting all of the works they could acquire or access that were derivatives of the research done on this movement, as well as some of the new material that contains the interviews with the members of this movement, or some of the national heroines of the Second World War. However, one of the issues that came up was the, let's say, controlled vocabulary or the tags, where they couldn't entirely settle on a controlled vocabulary because it doesn't exist, so to speak, and we didn't have the resources to work with them on trying to involve the wider professional community who also manages these objects to kind of settle on common standards of tagging or description. But the other part that is here is these books that are mostly that are not only the books that were published on these in this period after the Second World War, but also documents that they've created through the exploration of the collection. So you have all these research here that they've included in the digital collection in order to help with the research of the movement that has been neglected for a while in the history of not only Bosnia and Herzegovina, but entire region that used to be called Yugoslavia. This is one of the examples of inclusion that we're trying to achieve. One example that I will not show it to you because it hasn't been finished, but it's also a question of the archives of marginalized groups, where they are also trying to use Omeka as a basis for the setup of the LGBTQI archives of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and to try to document the history of the movement from the 80s until now, not only in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but also surrounding countries that influenced the movement here as well. Now I will go back to the museum. So I've shown you here, as you can see, it can be adapted and so on, but the metadata set is quite simple. It does sometimes cause some issues in terms of rights and so on, how to describe them, and this needs to be refined and so on. But as long as there's some kind of structured data, you can work with it and then work on fixing the issues. Omeka also allows for this bibliographic citation, which is important for any museum or archival or library institution that contains these kind of collections, so it can be properly referenced in any kind of research, which then puts the institution on the map. But let me show you the collective access. The version that the metadata set that we are testing is based on Spectrum. And as you can see here, the collective access has been localized to a certain extent on several languages. I know it was localized to Serbian. I localized it to Bosnian, but unfortunately, I've never committed these translations to these new versions, so I have to talk to them to include them for future reference. But even if you use it in English, it's quite okay. So here we have something that I've mentioned is probably today a biggest cause of friction between the museum community in mostly Western world and communities that were former colonies of these countries, where the proper documentation on acquisition hasn't been entirely preserved and so on, and it causes a lot of issues in returning some of the items that were not legally obtained here. And this element is something that I would say is probably something that will solve it. But most of the museum management systems of any sort today describe these acquisitions and requests or gifts or loans, whatever, in an unstructured data element, which doesn't allow it to actually find new connections for researchers or even curators of these collections in terms of who are the prominent people who held or bequested these objects to these museums and so on, because most of them are kind of hidden in this unstructured description that cannot be retrieved easily and then visualized and so on. The other part that is important, not that much for the Museum of Literature and Theater, but for instance for the National Museum, is this element here that allows for description of different elements in the collection, if it's as diverse as it is in the National Museum, and plus you can describe the okay. So the reason why I'm showing the collective access is because I really like these kind of works, because they allow for the community to get involved, and it allows us to control the process of development. While the companies are mostly, they do work with the communities that they are trying to sell the product to. They don't always have the best interest or intent in mind. And free and open source software community is kind of there to work together with the community, develop it within these institutions, like Omeka was developed as well as collective access, and then involve even more members of the community here. I will move to an issue of cultural heritage of Bosnia and Herzegovina, particularly Turbe, which I mentioned is a monumental grave of prominent people in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Muslims, and they've been explored and researched and so on, but haven't been documented in this way before. And two of my colleagues, Professor Leila Hajdar-Pasic and Assistant Professor Jayla Katab, have been working extensively on this project of documenting these objects, but they've faced an issue when they started working with Omeka. They liked the fact that you could geolocate all of these objects and so on, but the description of each of these objects could not be entirely done with use of Dublin Core, because Dublin Core is mostly focused on describing the digital representation of the object and not the object itself. So what they've decided is that they've used the VRA as a basis, which allowed them to describe not only not the digitized objects, but the objects themselves. The only issue here is that VRA is, as far as I know, being translated to any of the languages in the region, but also any other languages. I think that maybe it was recently translated to Chinese and French. But that doesn't prevent you from looking into these objects. Now, I will mention one thing that both Omeka and collective access do, which do cause some issues, and that is how do you actually offer this kind of knowledge to the wider community that doesn't speak any of the South Slavic languages that are official languages in Bosnia and Herzegovina in the region. And that can be solved to some extent through repeating these titles in English. I would say that collective access has a better solution where they, once you, I'll just go to any of these objects just to show you what I'm talking about. Where you can, need to zoom in a bit, where you can, not that much, where you can actually type in the title, but also say in a language the title is written, or any other text element that requires this. And this is a better solution because in terms of Omeka is still very much limited to just one language. There is a plugin that allows you to change language interface, but okay, I see your question right now, but let me just finish this and then I'll answer that. And I think that partly I will answer now because again, open source software sees these issues, and I do see linked data as a really important element of museum community, because that is the only way that these artifacts can be discovered without people stumbling to the websites of the respective institutions, but that they can be also connected to other elements and objects that were derivatives of these objects and so on. But I will, in short, some. But like I said, the open source projects are really great because they have the way to adapt to this. But the second part of your question, I'll probably answer later. So like I said, I'll just show you the sandbox of Omeka, which is a bit different. Sometimes the only issue I have to mention also that collective access has still not been adapted to some of the newer versions of PHP. So if you try to test it, try to limit if you have the experience with testing, limit yourself to 7.4 PHP because you will lose your mind with trying to get it to work if you go to PHP 8 or even 9 today. So as you can see, the metadata here is a bit different. If I actually go to items and try to add the new item, while Omeka had a very specific set of Dublin core in a really long list, here they've kind of separated it to different elements, which I like, and they don't necessarily insist on using all of the elements. They just tell you which elements are important if you just don't want to use your resource template. But as you can see here, there are different templates, and this templating is something that is useful because it allows for more of the description of the visual work here, like the artwork, so you can then change some of the elements. And here, in terms of the Dublin core Dublin core type, you can also talk about what is this resource related to in its class and so on. So, but what I wanted to say is that once you kind of create this item, then you can actually also assign it to a very specific set as well, so it can be interchanged, and you can create, which is, in my opinion, very important, digital, not necessarily digital exhibition, but also, let's say, a digital representation or follow-up on the exhibition, and it's easier to create these information tools for anyone who comes into the institution to follow the exhibition that they're following. But on the other side, they also have the CSV import, which is which is important, and you can import the classic projects as well through these API endpoints. So the transfer from the classic mode to this collaborative mode is easier. And finally, there's another project that I'm not involved in, but I was let's say consulted on, and they've asked me about this Zotero well, import, because one of the newspapers in the northeastern part of Bosnia and Herzegovina that stopped being published for, I think, 20 years ago, but it is a very important cultural source of cultural information for the region. They've listed all the articles in Zotero as a bibliographic record, and then they wanted to digitize most of these articles and present them in Omeka. And so this kind of plugins that were publicly made by the community allow them to import this already existing structured data to Dublin Core data set from a very specific bibliographic record. So all these plugins can be explored depending on where you go, but either through modules, and you can see here that there are a lot of plugins that allow you for adaptability, even prevention of accessing certain larger scale digitalized objects while you can access them as well, but also allowing certain people to access these objects based on your desire, and so on, or their request. And as you can see, you also have the RDF here, but also, like I've said, VRA core schema can be incorporated into Omeka, but any other schema can be as well incorporated. It's not an easy task to do, but that's why we always have colleagues who are more technically savvy who can do this, and then we can talk about some other adaptation. I will just show you also this educational element, let's say, of our work and use of Omeka. At one point, we'll probably encompass all of these projects into Omeka S so we can interchange them, even though I'm not sure how the VRA core will work with this one. But the reason why I wanted to show it to you is because we don't have collections that much, but each object basically is a collection. So it's not an item or a document here. And as a non-material element of culture, we try to encourage our students to explore how do you actually represent through metadata any of these non-material objects of culture through these kind of systems. So you have Milman Perry collection of oral literature, and some of these descriptions are not entirely great because this is used as a learning tool. But as you can see, they try their best. Like here, we only have one file, but in other cases, like for instance, tattooing or celebration of Easter, or our folk songs, it's something that some of the students really got involved in and were enthusiastic. And it forced them to negotiate rights, for instance, with some of the institutions, but not only institutions, but other holders of rights of different objects, like journalists, photojournalists, and so on, where we encourage them to contact them, ask them for if their specific object, like a photo or something, or even a story, can be included in this collection as well, so they can understand better how to negotiate these issues when they are trying, if hopefully they start working in some of our institutions in Bosnia-Herzegovina or elsewhere. I will just go back to my presentation. So the question is, like, there's so many of you in this webinar, so I don't know all of your histories and where did you read, like, where does your institution or your career stand? But I wanted to offer some kind of let's say advice or starting point of how to start working on these issues, which will in turn help you basically to resolve all of these social issues that exist out there in terms of ownership, decolonization, but also, which is really important, inclusion of the community in museum work, because that will kind of empower the institutions to stay afloat, to exist, and get better funding in return. So I would say that you need some kind of structure. So you create a table, preferably in Excel, not in Word, or Google spreadsheets, or any kind of other open office spreadsheets and so on, where you will create a structure that conforms to your needs. It doesn't have to be a metadata set that already exists. It can be just a list, like I've shown you the list of that the students did here, that started from the point how the museum has been logging their acquisitions for the past 60 years. Not the best solution, but it is not the best way maybe in today's age, but it is enough to start. And to input the basic recommended data based on the standard that you choose. That's the second option that you could do, explore the standard that works for you and so on, and play with XML. So I'll show you this particular software is unfortunately XML editor is licensed, so you need to license it, but it's not that hard to get a license or a test license. But there are a number of open source XML editors. I mean, even if you use Visual Studio Code, you can read these items as well. Except that if this starts working, except that in this case you can see the structure better. Unfortunately, I cannot show it to you because the program decided to stop working. But XML is probably the most important element of the whole story of the metadata, and it is the one joining force of exchanging data between different institutions, not only between museums, but also libraries, archives, and so on. And it is an important object that we can read as humans, like I've mentioned in the beginning, but also machines can parse and incorporate into different future data sets. The good thing is that you can export XML, most of your descriptions in XML, and then map it, but you require some kind of the document type definition or something that will validate all of this. In all of this, the most important lesson that I've gained is that we collaborate, ask, and explore. I don't know everything, and no one does. And collaboration is something that I think has been always the most important element of all of our professions, information professions. And then remix, which is kind of a weird term to use here, but in that sense, just remix the data, play with it, and so on, and then reach a final decision of what you are going to use. As long as you have some kind of structure, you can adapt or amend any existing metadata set. But the final goal of all of this is to share and offer a single point of access for all of your information objects. That in European context, the Europeana is trying to do to some extent. And that is a bit of a more complex issue. But if you don't have any kind of metadata that cannot be transformed from Dublin Core to Europeana or any other metadata set, then you cannot actually start going towards this final goal. And without metadata, you cannot use properly artificial intelligence in a sense of helping you to identify and discover new perspectives of your collection, just like this museum did recently, where they've connected their information system to ChatGPT and collaborated with, let's say, an AI to build a new exhibition. It was still human controlled. It was still in the hands of the curators, but according to their admissions, some of the things that AI suggested they wouldn't think of, including in this exhibition, and it helped them to some extent to explore and experiment with AI and build this exhibition. Of course, like I said, everything is still in human hands, and it should be in human hands. But AI can help us, and if we have metadata, then it can definitely help us because it can analyze this data faster, find different links that we may not find through a simple search of the system, and suggest it. And also, we cannot even think of a new way of making our collections more accessible to wider audience, and making it more democratic in terms of not forcing everyone to learn the standards that we have to learn, because we control and still mediate with these subjects. So I'll stop here. I'll stop sharing. And I think I'm on time, Aida, or did I miss?
Thank you very much, Fedja, for this detailed presentation. And I will stop recording as promised.